On a cold January night in 1948, inside the stone walls of the Sisters of Mercy Asylum, a woman gave birth to a child that was not human. The nuns who witnessed it never spoke the same again, and those halls were never silent after. Before we step into this story, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and let's begin. The heavy iron gates of the Sisters of Mercy Asylum loomed against the grey morning sky, their blackened bars twisted by decades of wind and rain. Inside, the sprawling stone building exhaled an air of solemnity that clung to the halls like incense smoke. It was 1948, and though the world outside seemed to hum with post-war optimism, the asylum existed in a quieter, more measured time, where whispers travelled faster than footsteps and secrets had a way of rooting themselves into the very walls. Sister Margaret moved with deliberate pace along the corridor, her rosary beads clicking softly against her habit. She paused outside room 7, a small chamber near the eastern wing, where the newest patient had been admitted. The woman's name was Eleanor Hayes, a young mother who had arrived in the night, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. The nuns had been told little about her condition beyond that she had given birth under circumstances no one could yet explain. The air inside room 7 was heavy with a tang of antiseptic and the faint, lingering scent of something else, something floral, yet oddly metallic. Eleanor lay on the narrow cot, shivering despite the warmth of the blankets. Her eyes were wide and dark, darting around the room as though she feared shadows would rise and claim her. Sister Margaret spoke softly, in a voice designed to calm, but Eleanor flinched. "They said it was a healthy child," the young woman whispered, her voice cracking. "But it isn't human." Sister Margaret knelt beside her, steadying the trembling hands that had somehow delivered life that was impossible to categorize. Her mind, trained to consider the boundaries of medicine and divine mystery alike, fought to reconcile the words with what she saw in the crib at the foot of the bed. The infant's skin was pale, almost translucent, with a sheen like damp porcelain. Its features were malformed, elongated in ways that made the human face unrecognizable, the eyes too large and glimmering with an intelligence that seemed alien. The nuns had been instructed by the asylum's director to treat the matter quietly, to keep the child under wraps until doctors could arrive from the city. But the other patients, wandering in the hallways in various stages of mental and physical fragility, had begun to sense that something was amiss. Murmurs of the newborn who was not of this earth travelled in fragments through the wings, growing with each passing hour. Some whispered that the child was a divine curse, others that it was the spawn of dark forces, and all felt a shiver of dread at the mere thought of it. Sister Margaret covered the infant carefully, noting the unnatural curvature of its limbs and the faint, irregular pulse beneath its skin. She pressed a finger to Eleanor's forehead, finding fever. The young mother's body had not fully recovered, and yet her eyes reflected a profound terror that seemed to bind her to the strange being in ways the nuns could not yet understand. Outside the room, the asylum maintained its routine as if nothing had shifted. Meals were served, beds were made, prayers were recited, and still Eleanor and her child existed in a corner of the institution that the others did not dare enter. There were noises at night, low, whispering sounds that seemed to emanate from the crib itself. At first, Sister Margaret thought it was the wind, or perhaps Eleanor murmuring in her sleep, but the pattern of the sounds suggested thought, calculation, an awareness that transcended the normal capabilities of an infant. By the second day, doctors arrived from the city, their shoes clicking against the stone floor, their eyes wide but controlled as they examined the infant. They murmured to each other in low tones, making notes in small leather-bound notebooks. One of them, Dr. Caldwell, finally turned to Sister Margaret with a strained expression. "This child defies every classification," he said quietly. "It is alive. It breathes. But it is not human. Its organs, its bones, they do not match anything recorded in medical literature." Sister Margaret looked at Eleanor, who clutched her blanket to her chest and whispered repeatedly, I didn't do this." Outside the room, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying with it a sense of foreboding that seemed almost sentient. The asylum, steeped in decades of human suffering and whispered prayers, now harbored a new anomaly, a presence that would test the boundaries of faith, medicine, and human endurance. And as the first night fell with an unnatural hush, the corridors seemed to shiver, as if aware that within room 7, a story had begun that could not be undone. The morning sun fell in thin, pale streams through the tall, iron-framed windows of the Sisters of Mercy Asylum, casting long shadows across the hallways. The light seemed almost hesitant, as if wary of penetrating the gloom that lingered in the eastern wing, near room 7. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with an unease that clung to the walls, whispered through the cracks, and settled in the corners where no one dared linger. Eleanor Hayes sat on the edge of her cot, staring down at the crib where her child rested, swaddled in blankets that did little to disguise the unnatural angles of its form. Her hands shook violently, betraying a fear that ran deeper than exhaustion or grief. It was the fear of the incomprehensible. Sister Margaret remained at her side, steadfast and unwavering, though even she could feel the weight of something beyond rational explanation pressing against her chest. She had spent years tending to patients with mental illness, with bodies broken by disease or circumstance, yet nothing she had encountered approached the strangeness of this birth. There was something about the child that defied the natural order. It was not merely malformed or sick. It was something altogether other. The doctors from the city had departed after the initial examination, their faces pale and their hands shaking slightly as they left notes for the nuns to follow. They had warned the sisters not to reveal the child to anyone, and certainly not to the patients. The asylum had a long history of rumors and hysteria, and even the faintest whisper could spiral into panic. But the presence of the child could not be hidden completely. The air itself seemed to hum with attention, and patients who passed by the eastern wing sometimes paused mid-step, their faces drawn tight with fear, their lips whispering words that barely formed into sentences. Eleanor's voice broke the silence. "It moves on its own," she said, her eyes wide. "It watches. I feel it. When I close my eyes, it's looking at me." Sister Margaret reached out, laying a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "It is still a child," she said quietly, though even her voice carried a tremor. "It has life, and life is sacred. We must care for it, even if we do not understand it." Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the crib, where the infant had shifted, its small limbs curling in ways that seemed impossible for human joints. A thin, melodic hum issued from the child's throat, so faint it was almost imperceptible. The sound was not crying, not cooing, but a vibration that seemed to resonate in the air itself, pressing lightly against the bones of the room. Eleanor flinched. Sister Margaret knelt beside the crib, inspecting the child more closely. The skin was an unnatural shade, pale with hints of grey and blue, translucent enough that the faint outlines of muscles and veins could be seen beneath the surface. The eyes, disproportionately large, reflected the light in a way that made it impossible to look directly at them for long without feeling an almost physical pressure behind the gaze. Its hands were long, fingers curling and uncurling with a rhythm that seemed intentional, deliberate. A sudden low noise came from the hallway outside the door, a scraping sound like nails against stone. Both women froze, listening. The asylum was usually quiet in the early morning, broken only by the distant echo of a bell or the shuffle of a patient's steps. But this sound carried intent, a sense of purpose that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand. Sister Margaret rose and moved to the door, peering into the dim corridor. No one was there, yet the sound persisted, faint now, as if receding with the retreating footsteps of something unseen. She felt an instinctive chill crawl up her spine. "Stay here," she whispered to Eleanor, though her own voice lacked conviction. Eleanor nodded, pressing the blanket to her face as if it could shield her from the knowledge of what had occurred. The child, meanwhile, remained in the crib, eyes fixed on Sister Margaret, following her movement with unnerving precision. The hum from the infant grew slightly louder, vibrating in the wooden floorboards and the stone beneath them. It was as though the room itself was listening. Over the next hours, the pattern became clearer. The child did not merely react to touch or sound, it anticipated them. When Eleanor shifted her hand near the crib, the infant moved preemptively. When Sister Margaret entered the room, the child's gaze met hers before she had taken more than a step. The doctor's notes had mentioned its intelligence, but the nuns began to sense that intelligence in a way that was more instinctual than rational. It was aware, calculating, and eerily patient. Word began to spread among the patients, despite the nuns' careful oversight. One woman, bedridden with fever, murmured of visions she had seen, a child with eyes like glass, staring at her from the dark corners of the hall. Another whispered to herself endlessly, pacing in her room, claiming she had heard the infant singing lullabies that spoke directly to her fears. The asylum, normally a place of quiet suffering, seemed to vibrate with an undercurrent of dread. By evening, Eleanor refused to leave the child's side, insisting that she could feel its awareness even when it slept. Sister Margaret tried to reassure her, though privately she felt a growing unease that went beyond concern for the mother. There was something in the child, something that resisted the natural world, and the longer it remained in the asylum, the more the fabric of reality seemed to shift. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the hallways, whispers echoed without source, and the faint hum that emanated from room 7 seemed to pulse in rhythm with the heartbeat of the building itself. When night fell, the corridors became nearly silent, save for the occasional creak of a floorboard or the distant call of an owl. Eleanor sat in the chair beside the crib, clutching her blanket and rocking slightly. The child stirred, reaching a delicate, elongated hand toward her. Its touch was cold, unnervingly so, but not painful. Eleanor flinched, yet could not withdraw. There was a strange comfort in the connection, a recognition of something that belonged, yet did not. Sister Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and duty. She had tended to the sick, the malformed, the dying, yet nothing had prepared her for this. This child existed outside the natural laws she had devoted her life to respecting, a presence that challenged faith and science alike. The nights would be long, and the hours heavier than stone, for in room 7 the first threads of a story were weaving themselves, threads that could not be unraveled without consequence. And somewhere in the shadows of the asylum, in the silent spaces between walls and floors, a presence stirred, listening, waiting, and aware of all who dared approach room 7. The asylum had always been a place of whispers. Long before Eleanor Hayes arrived with her strange child, the patient spoke in hushed voices about the sounds in the walls, the footsteps on the upper floors where no one was allowed, the dreams that seemed too real to dismiss. But after the birth, after the presence of the child seeped into the very mortar of the Sisters of Mercy, the whispers grew into something more, an undercurrent of dread that infected every corridor, every cell, every chapel pew. It began with small things, keys that vanished from the hooks where the sisters hung them, food trays that shifted places when no one was near, candles that guttered out all at once, as though a sudden breath had swept through the halls. The nuns exchanged looks but said nothing, for the rule of silence forbade idle speech outside of prayer or necessity. But their eyes told the truth. They were afraid. Eleanor hardly slept. She sat beside the crib in room 7 night after night, her body weakening, her face paling, yet she could not pull herself away. Whenever she tried to rest, her dreams carried her back to the child's gaze. She saw it not as an infant, but as something larger, ancient, stretching out across a dark landscape she could not name. In the dream it whispered, though no words were formed, only intent, only hunger. She woke with her throat raw from screaming, but when she looked down at the crib, the child was silent, watching as if amused. On the 3rd night of its life, a patient named Jonathan Marks was found wandering the east wing, his bare feet blackened from soot, his hospital gown torn. He had somehow slipped past 2 locked doors to stand outside room 7. When the sisters found him, he was kneeling, palms pressed flat to the floor, muttering the same sentence again and again. "It wants to be known. It wants to be known." The sisters restrained him gently, carrying him back to his cell. He wept like a child, clinging to the edges of their habits, begging them not to take him away from the voice in the crib. That night, Jonathan refused to eat. By morning, he was dead, his body limp on the cot, his mouth frozen in a smile. The asylum's director, Father Harrington, called the nuns to a private meeting in the refectory. His face was pale, lips pressed tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to keep from trembling. "This cannot leave these walls," he said, his voice a low rasp. "We are a house of God. We are a sanctuary. If the outside world hears of this child, the asylum will be destroyed. The church will be shamed. We will care for it, we will study it, but we will not speak of it beyond these gates." Some nodded. Others hesitated. Sister Agnes, the oldest of the sisters, crossed herself 3 times and whispered, "This is no child of God." Father Harrington silenced her with a glare. "It is alive. That is enough." In the days that followed, the asylum became divided. Some of the sisters believed the child was a test of faith, a burden they must carry as evidence of divine mystery. Others whispered that it was a punishment, a manifestation of sin. The patients felt it too. Even those who had not seen the infant spoke of it in their sleep, waking in terror, swearing they had felt its eyes upon them. Eleanor grew weaker with each passing day. Her body, still ravaged from childbirth, seemed unable to recover. Yet her mind burned with a feverish devotion to the child. She spoke to it constantly, murmuring lullabies, fragments of memory, prayers twisted into shapes that no longer sounded like prayers at all. She claimed it spoke back, not in words, but in sensations that filled her mind like smoke. One evening, Sister Margaret entered room 7 to find Eleanor sitting upright in bed, her eyes glassy, her lips moving as though in conversation. The child lay still in the crib, but its eyes were fixed upon her, unblinking. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" Sister Margaret asked softly. Eleanor turned, her face radiant with a strange kind of joy. "It told me its name." Margaret froze. "What name?" Eleanor leaned close, whispering into the sister's ear. The sound was so faint that it seemed to vibrate rather than form letters, a string of syllables that made Margaret's stomach lurch. It was not a name meant for the human tongue. She drew back, her hand to her chest. "Don't speak it again," she whispered. But Eleanor smiled, her face fever-bright. "It wants to be known." That night, the asylum trembled. The storm outside battered the stone walls, wind howling through the chimneys like a chorus of voices. In the chapel, candles flared and died in unison, plunging the sisters into sudden darkness mid-prayer. Patients screamed in their cells, some clawing at the walls, others rocking themselves into a stupor. And in room 7, the child sat upright in the crib for the first time, its movements steady, deliberate. It did not cry. It did not coo. It hummed, a sound that spread through the halls like a vibration, crawling into the bones of every living thing within the asylum. Those who heard it later swore it was not a sound but a thought, pressed into their minds, commanding obedience. Sister Margaret held her crucifix tightly, forcing herself to remain in the room. Eleanor wept beside the crib, reaching for the child, whispering its unspeakable name again and again, as though in worship. The wind battered harder. The storm reached its peak. And somewhere deep within the asylum's foundations, the ancient stones groaned as if under unbearable weight. The sisters gathered in prayer, their voices cracking under the strain of unseen pressure, their faith tested against something that no scripture had prepared them for. For the first time since its founding, the Sisters of Mercy Asylum was no longer merely a refuge for the broken. It had become a dwelling for something that did not belong to this earth. By the time the storm passed, the asylum was no longer the same place it had been. The air was heavy, as though saturated with a residue that clung to lungs and skin alike. The patients, already fragile, walked the corridors with vacant eyes, muttering half-formed words that seemed to echo Eleanor's feverish whispers. Some drew strange symbols into the dust on their windowsills, curved lines and spirals no one had taught them, yet eerily consistent from cell to cell. The nuns did their best to restore order, but even their rigid discipline faltered. Meals went uneaten. Prayer was interrupted by fits of laughter or sudden, violent sobbing among the patients. Sister Agnes, once so firm in her convictions, refused to enter the East Wing altogether. She sat in the chapel for hours, rocking and praying beneath the gaze of the crucifix, though her prayers became fractured, slipping into silence whenever the hum from room 7 carried down the halls. Father Harrington grew sterner with each day, demanding that the sisters show no weakness. His voice, normally calm and measured, cracked with strain as he ordered daily inspections of the child. He claimed it was for the sake of science, for proper documentation. But the way his eyes lingered on the infant, wide and transfixed, betrayed a fascination that bordered on obsession. Sister Margaret noticed it most clearly. She saw the way his hand sometimes trembled when he reached toward the crib, the way he lingered too long when Eleanor whispered the child's name into the silence. Eleanor herself seemed to thrive in her weakness. Her body was wasting away, yes, her cheeks hollow, her skin stretched thin over bone, but her eyes burned with a fervor that frightened the sisters more than her illness. She spoke to no one but the child. When she did, her words were soft, lilting, full of reverence. At times, the sisters would pause at the doorway, convinced she was reciting scripture, until the words twisted, syllables bending into shapes unfit for human tongues. One morning, Sister Margaret entered room 7 to find Eleanor cradling the child against her chest, humming in perfect harmony with the sound that issued from its throat. The sight froze her in place. The child's limbs curled around its mother, not in the clumsy way of an infant, but with intention, holding her tightly as though claiming her. Its eyes locked on Margaret, and for the first time she felt a sharp pressure behind her own eyes, as if something were probing, searching. She stumbled back, clutching her rosary. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. The sound ceased instantly. The child turned its head, almost curiously, and Eleanor hissed through her teeth, a sound so unnatural that Margaret's skin prickled. "Do not speak that here," Eleanor said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Margaret fled, but the words followed her, clinging like smoke. "Do not speak that here." Later that evening, the asylum experienced its first true rupture. A young patient named Ruth, who had been silent for weeks, erupted into a violent frenzy in the dining hall. She overturned tables, screaming a single word again and again, the same unholy name Eleanor had whispered into Margaret's ear days before. It tore from her throat like fire, each repetition louder, until 3 nuns were needed to restrain her. But as they pinned her to the cold stone floor, she smiled, eyes wide and shining, and whispered in a voice not her own, "It is awake." The sisters recoiled, crossing themselves. Ruth convulsed once and fell limp, unconscious. She remained in that state for 2 days, breathing shallow, neither waking nor responding. The asylum's atmosphere grew unbearable after that. Nights became torment. The halls filled with sounds, scratches against the walls, whispers beneath the floorboards, footsteps pacing where no one walked. Patients claimed to see shadows that didn't belong to their bodies. One insisted she had watched the child's reflection in her water basin, though she was nowhere near room 7. The reflection, she said, smiled at her. In desperation, Father Harrington ordered an exorcism. He did not consult the church in Rome, for he feared scandal. Instead, he gathered the sisters in the chapel and commanded Margaret to bring Eleanor and the child before the altar. The procession through the asylum was grim. Patients pressed against the bars of their cells to watch, some weeping, others grinning manically as the crib was wheeled down the hall. Eleanor followed, gaunt but proud, her eyes locked on the small form swaddled in white. Margaret walked beside her, clutching the crucifix so tightly her knuckles bled. In the chapel, candles flickered violently as the child was placed near the altar. Harrington began the rites in a voice strained but resolute. The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling, prayers of deliverance and purification, ancient words meant to bind what did not belong. At first, nothing happened. The sisters prayed in unison, their voices filling the air. Then the child opened its mouth. A sound poured forth, not a cry, not a scream, but a resonance that shook the rafters. It was low, vibrating through stone and wood alike, and the flames of every candle bent toward it as though drawn by unseen gravity. Harrington faltered, his Latin stumbling. The sisters covered their ears, some collapsing, their rosaries clattering to the floor. Eleanor laughed. It was not the laugh of a broken woman, but of someone triumphant. She stepped forward, arms outstretched, her voice rising to join the hum, reciting the forbidden name without fear. Harrington shouted, thrusting his crucifix toward her, "Begone, in the name of the Father." But before he could finish, every candle in the chapel extinguished at once, plunging the asylum into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of breathing, not human breathing but vast, as if the very stones inhaled and exhaled. The sisters clung to one another, praying blindly. Margaret fell to her knees, clutching the crucifix against her chest, whispering Hail Marys through her tears. When the candles finally flared back to life, Harrington lay on the floor, his crucifix shattered, blood trickling from his mouth. Eleanor stood beside the altar, the child cradled in her arms, her eyes blazing with a light that was not her own. The exorcism had failed. The asylum would never recover from what had been unleashed that night. The chapel smelled of wax and blood. The candles burned low, casting trembling halos of light across the stone floor where Father Harrington's body lay. His death was not accompanied by the theatrics of martyrdom. No thunder, no lightning, no heavenly voice to carry him away. He simply lay there, motionless, a servant of God struck down in the very house where he had sworn to keep order. The sisters gathered around him, their habits streaked with ash from the extinguished candles, their hands shaking with a fear they dared not confess aloud. Some crossed themselves again and again, whispering the rosary until their voices grew hoarse. Sister Agnes wept openly, muttering that it was blasphemy to have brought the child into the chapel in the first place. Others glared at Eleanor, who stood at the altar, the infant clutched to her chest, her face glowing with something that resembled joy. "It is not the devil," Eleanor said, her voice rising above the tremors of fear. "You don't understand. It's something greater, something older. It has chosen me." Her words struck the nuns like blows. Chosen. That word, so often used in Scripture to describe prophets and saints, now applied to this frail woman and the creature she carried. Sister Margaret, who had not moved from her knees, lifted her head. Her face was pale, her lips bloodless, but her eyes burned with defiance. "You are deceived, Eleanor. This is not God's work. This is corruption. This is poison in the shape of a child." Eleanor only smiled, as though Margaret's words were meaningless. She kissed the top of the infant's head, ignoring its clammy, unnatural skin, and whispered the forbidden name. The sound seemed to linger in the air, heavy and thick, as if the stones themselves remembered it. The sisters tried to gather themselves. Father Harrington's body was carried out of the chapel, covered hastily with a sheet. They buried him before dawn in the asylum's small graveyard, their prayers quick, their eyes darting nervously at every shadow. No one outside the asylum was informed. To admit the truth would invite scandal, investigation, and perhaps destruction. And so, the asylum closed its gates tighter, binding itself in secrecy as the storm inside continued to grow. In the days that followed, the asylum became a place unmoored from order. Patients no longer followed their routines. Some refused to eat. Others gathered in corners, whispering to one another in a strange, rhythmic cadence. When asked what they were saying, they only smiled or laughed. A group of 3 women began scratching spirals into the walls with their fingernails, tearing their skin down to bone, oblivious to the pain. The sisters tried to maintain discipline, but even they were not immune. At night, some of them heard the hum of the child in their dreams. They woke drenched in sweat, their rosaries clenched so tightly in their fists that the beads cut into their skin. Sister Agnes collapsed in the refectory one morning, insisting she had seen Father Harrington walking the halls, his mouth sewn shut, pointing toward room 7. Sister Margaret resisted as best she could. She clung to prayer, to ritual, to the words of Scripture that had steadied her all her life. But even she could not ignore the way the air thickened around the east wing, the way the candles dimmed when she entered the child's room, the way Eleanor's hollow eyes seemed to hold both madness and clarity at once. Eleanor herself no longer resembled the woman who had arrived broken and trembling. Her body remained gaunt, but her movements were steady, purposeful. She spoke with authority, her voice carrying through the halls like a sermon. The patients began to gather around her, listening as she whispered to them, teaching them the name that had once made Margaret sick to hear. Soon they were repeating it back, their voices trembling in unison, filling the corridors with its resonance. The asylum, once a place of silence and order, became a temple of murmurs. One night, Margaret crept to room 7, determined to see the child without Eleanor present. She carried a lantern and her crucifix, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was empty save for the crib. The child lay there, its eyes open, glowing faintly in the dark. Margaret approached cautiously, holding the crucifix before her. "In the name of Christ, leave this place," she whispered. The infant blinked. Its lips parted, and from its throat came not a cry but a word. A single word, perfectly formed, spoken in a voice that was neither infantile nor human. Her crucifix slipped from her hand. The sound entered her like a knife, cutting through her resolve, rooting itself in her memory. She stumbled back, gasping for air, and fled the room, leaving the lantern sputtering behind her. From that night forward, Margaret knew she was no longer merely caring for a strange child. She was living in the presence of something that had learned to speak, something that had begun to grow in ways no child should. The asylum descended deeper into chaos. Reports spread among the sisters of patients who spoke in tongues, of shadows that moved against the light, of mirrors that no longer reflected truth. The air in the east wing smelled faintly metallic, as though blood had soaked into the stones. And Eleanor, she was no longer just a mother. She was a priestess, her voice carrying the authority of something beyond human comprehension. When she spoke, the patients listened. When she raised her hand, they obeyed. She walked the halls with her child, swaddled close to her chest, and wherever she passed, silence followed, as though the asylum itself was holding its breath. One evening, the sisters gathered in secret, their faces pale with exhaustion. "We cannot contain this," Sister Agnes said, her voice breaking. "If we do not destroy it, it will consume us all." But Margaret shook her head. "It is not that simple. It is not only the child. Eleanor is bound to it. To strike one is to strike the other." The others looked at her, some with horror, others with resignation. They knew what she meant. To save the asylum, Eleanor might have to die. That night, as Margaret lay in her narrow bed, she heard the hum again. But this time it was not from the east wing. It was in her own room, low and steady, vibrating through the mattress. She sat up, clutching her rosary, her breath caught in her throat. And in the shadows, just beyond the edge of her vision, she thought she saw the faint outline of the child, too small to walk, yet standing, watching her with eyes that glowed in the dark. The asylum was no longer merely haunted by suffering. It had become a cradle for something rising, something patient, something that wanted to be known. The Sisters of Mercy Asylum was never silent anymore. Even in the dead hours before dawn, when once the only sounds had been the creak of wood or the faint sigh of sleeping patients, There was now a constant undercurrent. Murmurs in the walls, scratches under the floorboards, the low, vibrating hum that seemed to seep from room 7 and into every stone of the building. Sleep became a rare, fragile thing, and when it came, it was filled with dreams that left the nuns waking in terror, their sheets damp with sweat. Sister Margaret moved through those days in a state of grim determination. Her body ached, her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she forced herself to maintain the rituals of care, feeding patients, cleaning wounds, reading scripture aloud in trembling cadence. Yet her heart quailed each time she passed the east wing, where Eleanor's presence was strongest. Eleanor no longer confined herself to room 7. She walked the halls openly now, the child wrapped in swaddling cloth against her chest. The infant's face was hidden from most, but its presence was undeniable. Wherever Eleanor went, patients followed. Some crawled from their beds to trail behind her like pilgrims. Others pressed their foreheads to the floor when she passed, whispering the forbidden name under their breath. The sisters tried to intervene, to pull patients away, but Eleanor's calm gaze was enough to stop them in their tracks. Her authority was no longer physical. It was spiritual, rooted in whatever power she had drawn from the child. One afternoon, Sister Agnes confronted her in the refectory. The tables had been cleared, and Eleanor sat at the head as though presiding over a congregation. Her followers gathered around her. Agnes, her voice trembling with both fury and fear, raised her crucifix. "You bring ruin upon this house," she said. "You are possessed, Eleanor Hayes. That thing in your arms is not your child, but a curse. Release it and repent." Eleanor did not rise. She stroked the bundle in her arms and smiled faintly. "This is not a curse, sister. This is revelation. You cling to your scriptures because you fear what is older, what is greater. But it has come, and it has chosen me." Agnes pressed forward, her crucifix shaking in her hand. "In Christ's name, I command you." The word died on her lips. The infant shifted beneath the cloth, and for an instant its eyes flashed visible, pale, luminous, inhuman. Agnes staggered backward, her crucifix falling to the floor. She clutched her chest, gasping. Her lips moved, but no words came. Then she collapsed, her body convulsing violently as patients looked on in silent reverence. When it ended, she lay still. Her eyes stared at the vaulted ceiling, lifeless. The sisters buried her at dawn beside Father Harrington. No one spoke during the burial. The earth was damp and heavy, and every shovel of dirt that fell onto the coffin seemed to echo with a finality that tightened Margaret's throat. She wanted to pray, to say something for Agnes's soul, but the words caught in her chest. If God still walked the halls of this asylum, he had turned his face away. The days blurred into one another. Eleanor's following grew. Patients who had once been incoherent began to speak clearly, their words structured but unsettling, repeating fragments of the same strange language. Others carved symbols into their skin, curved lines that bled but did not fester. They gathered in the chapel at night, not for prayer but for something else, a ritual that Margaret dared not watch too closely. The sisters themselves were fracturing. Some still clung to discipline, trying to suppress the growing tide. Others, weakened by exhaustion and fear, began to fall silent, their gazes drifting when Eleanor passed, their lips twitching as though they, too, were repeating the forbidden name under their breath. Margaret felt as though she was the last one holding a line that had already been broken. She prayed in secret, her rosary beads worn smooth from endless repetition. Yet even in prayer, the name slipped into her thoughts, unbidden, curling around her words like smoke. Sometimes, in her most desperate moments, she realized she had been whispering it without meaning to, and she clamped her hand over her mouth in horror. One evening, Margaret found herself outside room 7 again. The door stood open, the lantern inside casting a dim glow. The crib was empty. Panic surged in her chest until she saw Eleanor, sitting on the bed, the child in her arms. She was humming softly, the melody unfamiliar, its rhythm unnatural. Margaret stepped into the room. "Eleanor," she whispered, "please, look at yourself. Look at what this place has become. People are dying. The sisters are changing. This is not salvation. It is destruction." Eleanor lifted her gaze. Her eyes were no longer hollow, but burning. "You don't see it, Margaret. This is not destruction. This is the beginning. They die because they cling to what is passing. But those who accept it, they are remade." She held the child out slightly, as if to present it. "Look at it. Do not see with fear. See with truth." Margaret's feet felt rooted to the floor. Her heart hammered, her body screamed to flee, yet her eyes fell unwillingly to the child. Its face was pale, its features wrong, but its eyes held her. She felt them pierce through flesh and bone, into her mind, unearthing thoughts she had buried, fears she had never named. For a moment, she felt herself slipping, falling into those eyes, into an endless expanse of dark water. She tore her gaze away, stumbling backward. "No," she whispered hoarsely. "I will not." Eleanor's smile was almost tender. "You will. In time, you all will." Margaret fled the room, her breath ragged, her crucifix clutched so tightly it cut into her palm. Blood trickled down her wrist, but she did not let go. That night, the asylum shook. The walls groaned, the air filled with the sound of many voices speaking as one, a chorus of whispers that spread from the east wing to the farthest cell. The patients rose from their beds, moving in unison, converging on the chapel without instruction. The sisters tried to stop them, but their strength was nothing against the tide. Margaret, dragged along by the current of bodies, entered the chapel and saw Eleanor standing at the altar, the child in her arms, her face radiant in the flickering candlelight. The patients gathered before her, kneeling, chanting the name in rhythm, their voices blending into the hum that shook the walls. Margaret fell to her knees, not from devotion, but from sheer weight. The sound pressed against her skull, threatening to split it open. She covered her ears, but it was inside her, vibrating through her bones, forcing her to hear. And then the child opened its mouth. A light spilled forth, not bright, not holy, but a dim, pulsating glow that filled the chapel. It cast no shadows, only distortion, bending the air like heat over flame. The patients cried out in ecstasy. The sisters wept in terror. Eleanor raised the child higher, her voice carrying over the chaos. "It is here. It has come, and we are its first." The hum swelled. The stone floor trembled, and Margaret realized, with a clarity that chilled her blood, that the asylum was no longer an asylum at all. It was a sanctuary. The transformation of the asylum was not sudden. It was gradual, like rot spreading through timber, slow at first and then unstoppable. By autumn, The Sisters of Mercy was no longer recognizable as a place of healing or penance. The daily rhythm of prayers, meals, and silence had been overtaken by rituals no scripture had ever prescribed. The chapel, once the heart of Catholic devotion, now pulsed with gatherings that blurred the line between worship and delirium. Eleanor presided over it all with calm assurance. She moved through the asylum as though it belonged to her, and in a way it did. The patients adored her, treating her as both mother and prophetess. They listened raptly when she spoke, repeating her words like catechism. Even some of the sisters, those too weary or too shaken to resist, began to lower their eyes when Eleanor passed, murmuring the forbidden name as though in prayer. But Sister Margaret held out. Her faith had become a fortress, though it was battered daily by fear and temptation. She clung to her rosary, to the crucifix that now bore the faint scars of her blood from so many nights of desperate grip. Every day she told herself, "I will not yield, not to it, not to her." Yet doubt crept in, subtle and insidious. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes in prayer, the name slipped into her thoughts unbidden, curling around the Hail Marys like ivy choking stone. The child had changed as well. It was no longer small in the way of infants. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, too long for its swaddling, its movements disturbingly precise. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the world in a way that unsettled anyone who dared meet them. The hum it emitted had grown more powerful, more invasive. Entire wings of the asylum now vibrated with it at night, driving patients into fits of ecstasy or madness. One evening, Margaret entered the West Wing and found a patient painting the walls with her own blood. Spirals and lines, intricate patterns that seemed to move when stared at too long. When Margaret tried to stop her, the woman only smiled and whispered, "It's teaching me. Can't you hear it? It's teaching all of us." Margaret washed the blood from the walls, her hands trembling, but the images lingered in her vision long after they were gone. The asylum's foundations began to suffer. Doors warped. Windows cracked. The air itself seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The smell of iron, of blood, was constant, even when no wound had been made. The sisters stopped keeping records. They stopped writing letters. The asylum became closed to the world, a sealed vessel drifting into darker waters. One night, Margaret was woken by the sound of footsteps in her room. She bolted upright, clutching her crucifix, and saw Eleanor standing at the foot of her bed, the child in her arms. The dim moonlight through the window barely illuminated her, but her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting something not of this world. "You're strong," Eleanor whispered. "Stronger than the others. That's why it wants you." Margaret's throat was dry. "Leave this room." But Eleanor stepped closer, lowering the swaddling just enough to reveal the child's face. Margaret tried to look away, but the eyes caught her, pulling her in like a tide. For an instant she saw herself, kneeling in the chapel, lips moving with the others, chanting the name in ecstasy. She saw her hands raised in supplication, her crucifix abandoned on the floor. She gasped, tearing her gaze away. "No!" Eleanor only smiled. "You cannot resist forever. None of us can. Better to embrace it now, before the pain grows." She left the room without another word, but the air remained heavy, and Margaret lay awake until dawn, clutching her crucifix with bleeding palms. The following week, the asylum reached its breaking point. The patients, led by Eleanor, gathered in the chapel nightly. Their chants grew louder, more insistent, echoing through every hall until sleep was impossible. The sisters who resisted locked themselves in their cells, praying desperately, but their voices were drowned out by the chorus. Margaret patrolled the halls, exhausted, her faith stretched thin as thread, but she could do nothing to stop the tide. One night, the ritual reached a climax. Margaret entered the chapel and found it filled wall to wall with patients, their bodies swaying in unison, their voices booming with the forbidden name. Eleanor stood at the altar, the child raised above her head, its eyes blazing. The air vibrated with such force that Margaret's teeth ached. Then it happened. The stone floor cracked. A fissure opened across the length of the chapel, splitting the altar itself. From the gap rose not fire, not smoke, but light, dim, pulsing, wrong. It poured upward, bending the air, making the walls ripple like water. The patients screamed, not in fear but in ecstasy, as though their prayers had finally been answered. Margaret dropped to her knees, clutching the crucifix, praying louder than she ever had in her life. "Deliver us, O Lord, deliver us." The light spread, filling the chapel, searing her eyes. She shut them tight, but even through her eyelids she saw it, pulsing, alive. The hum became a roar, shaking every stone of the asylum, and through it all, Eleanor's voice rang clear. "It is here. It walks among us. We are remade." When the light faded, silence followed, a deep, suffocating silence. Margaret opened her eyes, her body trembling. The patients were still kneeling, their faces slack, their eyes glowing faintly. Eleanor stood at the altar, the child in her arms, her smile serene. But the chapel was changed. The crucifix above the altar hung twisted, the figure of Christ distorted as though melted. The walls were inscribed with patterns that had not been there before, spirals and lines etched deep into the stone. And beneath it all, Margaret felt it, a presence vast and patient, now fully awake. The asylum was no longer merely its cradle. It was its dwelling. By winter, the Sisters of Mercy Asylum had become a fortress of silence and shadows. Snow fell heavy on the grounds, piling against the windows, muffling the world beyond, yet within the walls there was no peace. The asylum throbbed like a living heart, every stone humming faintly with the pulse of the child. What once had been corridors of prayer and penance were now passageways lined with patient disciples, their eyes faintly aglow, their lips whispering ceaselessly. The sisters who still resisted had dwindled to 3, Margaret, Lucia, and Catherine. Their faces were gaunt from hunger, their eyes hollow with sleeplessness. They had taken to hiding in the abandoned infirmary, praying together in hushed voices, daring only to leave in daylight when Eleanor's processions were least frequent. Even so, they knew the asylum was closing in around them. Sister Catherine broke first. It was the night after Epiphany. The 3 had gathered in a corner, clutching their rosaries, reciting psalms. Catherine's voice faltered, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her fingers loosened around the beads. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't bear it any longer. I hear it even when I sleep. It calls my name. It won't let me go." Margaret reached for her, gripping her hands tightly. "Hold fast, Catherine. Do not yield. This is a test." But Catherine's eyes shimmered with tears, and something else. a faint glow beneath her pupils. She pulled her hands free, trembling. It doesn't feel like a test. It feels like truth. She rose and walked out before they could stop her. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, steady, deliberate. The next morning, Catherine stood beside Eleanor in the chapel, her face serene, her lips moving with the others. Margaret saw her and felt her heart break. One more had been lost. The chapel had become unrecognizable. The crucifix was gone, replaced by a carving in the stone, a vast spiral that stretched across the entire wall. The patients gathered before it daily, chanting and rocking in unison, while Eleanor stood at the center, the child raised high. Its hum now resonated through the entire building, a low vibration that rattled teeth and bones. One evening, as Margaret and Lucia knelt in the infirmary, the walls began to sweat, not with water, but with something darker. A thick, red seepage trickled down the plaster, smelling of iron. Margaret pressed her hand against it, recoiling when it burned her skin. The asylum was not only alive, it was bleeding. That night, Margaret dreamed. She stood in the chapel, but the walls were gone, replaced by an endless ocean under a black sky. Eleanor was there, holding the child, her feet standing on water as though on solid ground. The patients were there too, kneeling, their faces lifted in worship. The child's hum became a roar, and from the ocean depths something vast began to rise, a shadow stretching to the horizon. Margaret woke screaming, her crucifix clenched in her fist so tightly it cut into her palm. Blood stained her sheets. Lucia tried to comfort her, but her eyes were fearful. "It is not just here, Margaret. It is in us, in our minds, our dreams. We cannot fight it forever." But Margaret would not yield. Her faith had become her armor, even if it cracked. She whispered psalms under her breath throughout the day, her voice raw, her throat aching. Yet she knew the balance was shifting. The turning point came when the asylum's doors opened. 4 months, no one had entered or left. The snow had cut them off, and perhaps Providence had kept outsiders away. But one bitter morning, as Margaret made her rounds, she heard the front gates groan. Through the frost-caked windows, she saw figures approaching. 2 men in dark coats, doctors sent from the city to check on the asylum after months of silence. Margaret's heart leapt with desperate hope. She rushed to the entry hall, meeting them as they stepped inside, stamping snow from their boots. "Please," she begged, "you must leave. Now. This place, it's not safe. You don't understand." But Eleanor was already there. She glided into the hall, the child in her arms, her face calm and radiant. The men froze, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe. Margaret watched in horror as their eyes softened, their shoulders relaxed. One of them dropped his satchel to the floor. "It speaks," one whispered. "It speaks without words." They followed Eleanor deeper into the asylum, leaving Margaret behind, her pleas unheard. Another 2 souls lost. From that day, the asylum no longer hid its corruption. Eleanor opened the gates at will, and those who entered never left. Travellers, beggars, the curious from the nearby town, all were drawn in, all were changed. The asylum became a beacon, its hum spreading outward, carrying on the wind. Margaret knew then that it would not remain confined. One night, she stood at a high window, staring out at the snow-blanketed grounds. The hum carried through the glass, reaching the distant town, echoing in the dark. She imagined families waking in the night, hearing it in their bones, feeling it seep into their dreams. She imagined the world beyond, unaware of what stirred within these walls. She gripped her crucifix, tears freezing on her cheeks. God, if you still walk with us, show me the way. Show me how to end this. But the silence that followed was heavier than any prayer. And in that silence, the hum grew louder. The asylum had ceased to be merely a dwelling. It was becoming a mouth. By spring, the snow had melted, and with it the last illusions of safety. The Sisters of Mercy Asylum no longer resembled an institution at all. It was a shrine. The gates stood permanently open, and those who approached the grounds did not hesitate to enter. They came from the nearby town first, then from farther villages, men and women with haunted eyes, children clutching their parents' hands, all drawn by the sound. For the hum had grown stronger, carrying beyond the walls, threading itself into the air like an invisible bell. It was not heard with the ears alone, but felt in the marrow, an insistent tug that no soul could easily ignore. Eleanor welcomed them all. She stood at the threshold with a child in her arms, her smile gentle, her voice like a balm. "You are home," she told them. "You have heard its call. You belong." And they believed her. They always did. Inside, the asylum pulsed with life. Patients and converts alike moved as one, their days no longer structured by meals or prayers, but by the rhythm of the hum. They gathered in the chapel morning and night, kneeling before the spiral etched into the altar wall, chanting the name until their voices were hoarse. The child was carried in procession, its eyes glowing faintly, its hum vibrating through the floorboards until teeth rattled in jaws. The sisters who had resisted were gone. Catherine had yielded. Lucia vanished one night and never returned, though Margaret sometimes thought she heard her voice among the chants. Margaret alone remained, the last fragment of what the asylum had once been. She moved through the halls like a ghost, praying silently, clutching her crucifix as if it were her very heartbeat. But even Margaret could feel it changing her. Her dreams were no longer her own. Every night she walked the endless ocean beneath the black sky, the spiral stretching across the horizon, Eleanor standing on the water with a child. Every night she woke with her body trembling, her lips raw from having whispered the forbidden name in her sleep. One morning she awoke to find her crucifix gone. She tore her chamber apart in desperation, finally discovering it in her own hand, clenched so tightly that her nails had drawn blood. But when she lifted it to her lips, the words of prayer faltered. The crucifix felt heavier, colder, as though the very metal recoiled from her touch. The asylum itself was changing. The walls no longer held steady. They pulsed faintly, like flesh beneath stone. The floors were veined with dark lines, branching out from the chapel, spreading through the corridors. Sometimes, when Margaret pressed her ear to the wall, she thought she could hear a heartbeat deep within, slow and terrible. One evening she saw Eleanor in the courtyard, addressing a crowd that had swelled to hundreds. Farmers, beggars, children, all stood in rapt silence as she held the child aloft. "It does not come to destroy," Eleanor told them. "It comes to reveal. What you call suffering is transformation. What you call death is rebirth. This world you cling to is crumbling, but it offers us something greater." The crowd bowed as one, their voices rising in a single chant that made the earth tremble. Margaret, watching from the shadows, felt her knees weaken. She wanted to scream at them to stop, to flee, but the words stuck in her throat. When she tried to pray, all that came out was a whisper of the forbidden name. That night, the chapel cracked again. The fissure that had split the altar months before widened, spilling not light this time but water, black, glistening with the stench of the sea. It flooded the floor, rising ankle-deep, yet the congregation did not flinch. They knelt in it, let it soak their garments, their eyes glowing brighter as the child's hum deepened into a roar. Margaret stood at the doorway, horror freezing her limbs. She could not deny what she saw. The chapel was no longer part of the asylum at all. It was part of something else. The sea she dreamed of was no longer confined to her sleep. It was here, breaking through, filling the world one drop at a time. The next days blurred. The asylum drowned in ritual. The spiral carvings spread across every wall, etched deeper by hands no human should possess. The air grew heavy, briny, as though the ocean itself pressed against the walls. And always, always the hum, louder, deeper, shaking the very marrow of bone. Margaret felt herself unraveling. Her prayers faltered. Her crucifix grew heavier until she could scarcely hold it. And yet she clung to it, because the alternative was surrender, and she knew what that meant. But on the first night of summer, she broke. She woke in the chapel, though she had no memory of walking there. She was kneeling in the black water with the others, her lips moving in time with their chant. Before her, Eleanor stood radiant, the child raised high, its eyes burning like twin stars. Margaret tried to stop, to close her mouth, but the name poured out of her unbidden, flowing with the voices around her. The fissure widened further, water surging, and something stirred beneath it. A vast shadow shifted in the depths, its enormity beyond comprehension. Margaret's mind recoiled, yet her body bowed lower, her forehead pressing to the wet stone, her lips whispering in worship. When she lifted her eyes, the child was staring directly at her. Its gaze pierced through flesh, through bone, into her very soul. And for the first time, Margaret felt not fear but longing. In that moment, she understood the truth that Eleanor had spoken all along. This was not destruction. This was revelation. And yet, deep within her, a spark remained. A fragment of the Margaret who had once believed, who had once prayed, who had once resisted. It whispered to her, faint and desperate, "Do not yield. Not yet. Not yet." The hum swelled. The waters rose. The asylum shook as though the very earth beneath it was breaking apart. The mouth was opening wider, and Margaret knew that soon the world beyond would hear its call. Summer burned across the land, and with it the hum spread farther than ever before. Farmers in the outlying villages abandoned their fields, walking in trances toward the gates of the Sisters of Mercy. Children slipped from their homes at night, guided by whispers only they could hear. The bells of the parish church in town fell silent. Father Brennan, the last priest, was seen walking barefoot along the road at dawn, his eyes glowing faintly as he whispered the name with a smile upon his lips. The asylum's grounds were no longer enough. The crowds swelled into the hundreds, then the thousands, filling the courtyards, spilling into the woods. They built fires at night, arranged in spirals, their smoke curling upward into patterns that seemed too precise to be random. From above, the land itself was reshaping into the spiral. Roads, fields, paths all bent as if pulled into its orbit. Inside, Margaret drifted between two selves. One still clung to the crucifix, lips cracked from whispered psalms. The other knelt willingly in the chapel's black water, her voice joining the chorus. Some nights she woke to find herself soaked, her rosary lost in the flood. Some mornings she woke clutching her crucifix so tightly it cut her hands anew. She no longer knew which Margaret was the dream and which was the waking. Eleanor had become more than a woman. She no longer walked, she glided, her steps soundless across water and stone. Her face glowed faintly, her hair drifting as if under unseen currents. And the child was no longer a child. It stretched tall in her arms, its limbs long and smooth, its skin pale as bone. Its eyes burned steadily, no longer merely reflecting but emitting light that warped the air around it. When it hummed now, the earth itself shook. One night, Margaret was drawn again to the chapel. She did not resist. She walked barefoot through corridors slick with brine, her crucifix dragging from her hand. The chapel was filled beyond bursting. Patients, villagers, strangers from far-off towns. They packed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes glowing, their lips moving in one endless chant. The fissure had widened into a gaping maw, black water flooding the floor to their knees. And from its depths something stirred. Closer now, so close Margaret could see shapes coiling just beneath the surface, vast and slow. Eleanor stood at the altar, or what remained of it, her arms raised. The child, no longer swaddled, no longer human, clung to her with elongated limbs, its gaze sweeping the congregation. Every voice rose as one, a tidal wave of sound, the forbidden name rolling through the air until the stone itself quaked. And then it came. The water surged upward, a column of black rising from the fissure. From within it, an arm, if it could be called an arm, emerged. Vast, scaled, slick with brine, its fingers too many, its shape too fluid to hold. It reached upward, curling against the chapel's vaulted ceiling, cracking the stone with ease. The congregation screamed, not in terror but in ecstasy. Margaret dropped her crucifix. It sank into the water without a sound. Her lips moved, and the name poured forth. She felt her body tremble with rapture and despair in equal measure. The last fragment of resistance within her was crumbling. The arm withdrew, but the water did not calm. The fissure widened further, spreading across the entire floor, swallowing pews, swallowing stone. The chapel was no longer a chapel, but the lip of something vast, something rising from beneath the world. Eleanor turned, her gaze falling on Margaret. For a moment, their eyes met. "You see now," Eleanor whispered, though her voice carried above the roar. "It is not the end. It is the beginning." Margaret's knees buckled. She fell into the black water, her hands pressing against the stone, her lips whispering prayers that bled into chants. Her crucifix was gone. Her faith was ash. And as the water surged, as the spiral widened across the land, Margaret understood. The Sisters of Mercy had given birth not to a child, but to an age where the hum would spread beyond these walls, beyond this town, beyond the horizon. An age where the sea beneath the world would rise, and all would kneel before what Eleanor had borne. The asylum was no longer a mouth. It was the first breath of something vast, something eternal, and the world was already listening. And so the Sisters of Mercy Asylum was only the beginning. The hum is still out there, waiting. If you felt it tonight, Stay close, because the shadows run deeper here on Eternal Obsidian. Subscribe, and don't look away.